Roughly 150 German paratroopers held a small, fortified position on the Maas in January 1945. Yet when Canadian troops linked up on 31st of January, the defenders had withdrawn. The battle was Operation Elephant, the final Canadian assault on Kapelsche Veer, a German bridgehead at a ferry crossing near Capelle in the Netherlands. It had taken 5 weeks, 4 major Allied attacks, artillery, tanks, flamethrowers, engineers, amphibious vehicles, and an attempt to send infantry down an icy river in canoes. The bridgehead was cleared. Its defenders didn't die in a final stand. A map explains why that ending took so long. Kapelsche Veer stood on a low, narrow polder position beside the Maas and Bergsche Maas. Canadian accounts call it a small island north of the Maas. Other descriptions call it a long island, a peninsula, or a bridgehead around the ferry harbour. All describe the same tactical problem: water nearby, flat open fields, high dikes, and almost no natural cover. The position ran for about 8 kilometres. At its widest point, it measured roughly 1,600 metres across. Its eastern end narrowed sharply, leaving little room to deploy troops or vehicles. Along the southern side, dikes rose about 6 metres above the surrounding land. Their slopes were steep, their tracks narrow, and their crests offered commanding views across the fields. A man crossing those fields could be seen. A tank attempting to climb onto a dike could be channeled into one route. A defending machine gun positioned on the dike could fire across ground where infantry had few places to disappear. Winter made every weakness worse. The fields were snow-covered, waterlogged, cold and windswept. Rain, sleet, thawing ice and mud turned the terrain into a problem for both sides, but the Germans had already dug in. They didn't have to cross it under fire. At the centre of the bridgehead stood the small ferry harbour. Nearby were 2 brick houses called Grapes and Raspberry by the Canadians. Those houses became landmarks because the German defensive system concentrated around them. Trenches, dugouts, bunkers, slit trenches, weapon pits, dike positions, and firing points that covered the open approaches. The position was small on paper. In practice, it was a defended corridor. The German defenders could fire down the dikes, withdraw into covered positions, and counterattack when Allied troops reached the houses or harbour. Infantry and armour had to move along exposed routes, cross waterways, climb dikes, and then clear strongpoints without giving the defenders time to regroup. That was why Kapelsche Veer resisted repeated attacks. The German bridgehead had appeared in late December 1944 during the winter stalemate along the Maas. On 24th of December, about 40 men from the German 712th Infantry Division crossed the Bergsche Maas and established the first foothold. By the end of the month, elements of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Division had taken over. Canadian sources identify the defenders with the 10th and 17th German paratroop regiments. Their garrison was generally estimated at roughly 150 men at a time, a reinforced company-sized force, not a battalion or regiment. Yet numbers alone didn't define the battle. The paratroopers had used the time available to strengthen the ground. Deep dikes concealed movement. Trenches and dugouts protected men from shell fire. Machine guns, mortars, small arms and artillery could be directed onto the open approaches. The ferry harbour gave the position a practical military function as well as a geographical one. The exact wording of German orders is unknown. No surviving document establishes that the garrison had literally been told to hold at all costs. What is certain is that it defended the bridgehead with determination, while German commanders reinforced and resupplied it across the Maas whenever conditions allowed. The first Allied attempt came on the night of 30th December 1944. The Polish 1st Armoured Division held this sector of the front. Its infantry attacked the bridgehead, but the open ground and German fire stopped the effort. The exact total varies between narratives, but the outcome does not. The Germans remained in place. A second Polish attack followed in the first week of January. Some accounts date the main assault to Epiphany, 6th January. Others place it during the night of 7th January. The Polish troops reached the harbour area, proving that the German perimeter could be penetrated. But they couldn't hold the ground they had reached. Counterattacks from the dikes and the fortified locality drove them back. Later accounts place Polish losses at either 120 or 123 dead and wounded. That was the first hard lesson of Kapelsche Veer. Reaching the harbour didn't mean the bridgehead had fallen. The defenders could yield ground, fire from prepared positions, and strike back into isolated Allied units before reinforcement arrived. The third assault brought in a different force and produced the same result. During the night of 13th–14th January, 47 Royal Marine Commando attacked with Norwegian troops in Operation Horse. The commandos approached from both flanks. They encountered heavy German mortar fire and determined resistance from positions the defenders could shelter in while their weapons covered the approaches. Horse failed. On 14th January, after it became clear that the Royal Marine attack had not removed the bridgehead, Lieutenant General John Crocker's headquarters ordered a larger operation. Elephant. The codenames had become larger. The force now assigned to the task was larger too. Crocker commanded 1st British Corps, then serving under 1st Canadian Army. He had first tried to neutralise the bridgehead with artillery. That didn't end the threat. The task passed to Major General Christopher Vokes and the 4th Canadian Armoured Division. The order recorded by Canadian engineers was direct: clear all enemy from Kapelsche Veer. Brigadier J.C. Jefferson's 10th Canadian Infantry Brigade would carry out the main attack. Its core infantry battalions were the Lincoln and Welland Regiment and the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada. Tank support came from the South Alberta Regiment, the Divisional Armoured Reconnaissance Regiment. Canadian engineers would have to build, repair, clear, ferry, and maintain the routes that allowed the attack to continue at all. Operation Elephant wasn't a casual frontal assault against a handful of men. The plan combined infantry, tanks, artillery, smoke, engineers, Buffalo tracked landing vehicles, Wasp flamethrower carriers, and a waterborne force in canoes. It aimed to attack from more than one direction and converge on the harbour, cutting off the German defenders from reinforcement and forcing the defensive system to collapse. The Lincoln and Wellands would lead the first assault. A and C companies were assigned to attack the eastern end of the position. B Company would cross toward the centre. D Company would remain in reserve, ready to reinforce success. The intended movement resembled a pincer: pressure from the east, pressure from the centre and west, then a drive toward the harbour and the houses called Grapes and Raspberry. A volunteer canoe force received a separate task. They would travel in 4-man Peterborough canoes from the eastern end of the island, paddle westward toward the harbour, land near the ferry crossing, and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the bridgehead. Canoes had been shipped from Canada. Before the battle, a surviving photograph shows Lincoln and Welland soldiers in white snow smocks training with them on the icy water. It was a remarkable plan because it revealed the battlefield's limits. The infantry couldn't simply spread across the open polder and overwhelm the defenders. The assault had to use dikes, crossings, waterways, smoke, and narrow routes because the terrain denied the attackers broad freedom of movement. Smoke was essential to the plan. A thick screen would conceal the exposed rifle companies moving over the dikes and protect the canoe party as it travelled toward the harbour. Artillery smoke shells and smoke generators were intended to obscure German observation from both the island and the far bank of the Maas. Wasps were equally important. The Wasp was a universal carrier fitted with a flamethrower projector. It was small and tracked, designed to bring flame close to defended positions. 6 Wasp carriers were allocated to the opening assault. Their purpose was practical: suppress close-range resistance long enough for the infantry to reach the German positions around the houses and dikes. Artillery would support the attack throughout the operation. One later account estimates that approximately 14,000 rounds were fired during the battle. The precise number of guns assigned remains uncertain, but the range of weapons was substantial, from the South Alberta Regiment's 75mm tank guns to medium artillery firing 5.5-inch shells. The operation's real obstacle was synchronization. Smoke had to remain in place. Infantry had to advance through it. Wasps had to reach the dike tops. Tanks had to get onto the island. Engineers had to keep crossings open. The canoe force had to avoid machine guns on both banks of the river. Artillery had to support the infantry without destroying the narrow routes the attackers needed. Kapelsche Veer had already defeated 3 attacks because its defenders could force those systems apart. Canadian engineers spent days trying to prevent that from happening again. At the eastern end stood a demolished bridge. The 9th Field Squadron, Royal Canadian Engineers, rebuilt it under German observation. The site lay only about 500 metres from the enemy positions. The sappers worked mostly at night, moving equipment by raft and manhandling heavy loads along icy roads. The improvised structure acquired a nickname, the Mad Whore's Dream. The bridge was a route, not a solution. Sherman tanks needed another crossing at the western end of the island. The work took place in partially frozen water. Blocks of ice clogged connectors and propellers. Ramps froze into mud. German patrols and mortar fire interrupted the labour. Snowstorms made navigation difficult. Everything about the operation depended on engineers making movement possible where the landscape resisted movement. The Canadian assault began at about 7:30 on the morning of 26th of January 1945. A smoke barrage appeared over the battlefield. The Lincoln and Wellens began moving toward the island. C Company advanced with Wasp flamethrowers, while A Company pushed along the eastern dike toward Grapes. B Company crossed toward the centre in buffalo-tracked landing vehicles. The canoe force began hauling boats over ice at the eastern tip. The plan began to break apart within minutes. C Company's Wasps couldn't climb the dike slopes. The carriers were tracked, but mud and steep banks defeated them. Several became stuck before they could reach firing positions. The infantry lost the close flame support intended to help them break into the German positions. A Company kept moving. Its leading men reached within about 30 yards of Grapes, but smoke, German fire, and the failure of the Wasps left the infantry exposed. German machine guns and mortars covered the dike line. A Company couldn't force its way through and had to pull back. The canoe force faced an even harsher problem. An inch of ice covered parts of the river. The volunteers had to drag their canoes over the ice before they could launch. The ice near the bank forced them toward the centre of the channel, where the current was stronger and the smokescreen less effective. German machine guns opened fire from the banks. Canoes were damaged or sunk. Men entered freezing water to free boats from ice and one another. Their white snowsuits became soaked, heavy and cold. Weapons froze after the immersion. Several men who reached the island found their rifles wouldn't fire. Only part of the canoe force reached the island. They couldn't continue toward the harbour. Instead, they joined the infantry already under pressure near A Company. The attempted waterborne stroke had failed before it could threaten the German rear. On the eastern side, the German defenders responded with counterattacks. They had survived the opening smoke and artillery. They moved out with mortar fire, machine guns, and infantry attacks against the exposed Canadian companies. A Company and C Company were driven back. C Company lost all of its officers. By late morning, the eastern thrust had collapsed. B Company had done better at first. It crossed in buffaloes and moved along a dike under smoke cover. For a time, the screen concealed the advance. Then the wind and battlefield conditions weakened it. The German defenders, now only about 50 yards away, opened fire. B Company stopped short of its objective, but it held its ground. By the end of 26th of January, it was the principal Canadian foothold on the island. The original pincer had become a series of separated, vulnerable positions. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders entered the battle to reinforce the attack. The South Alberta Regiment brought tanks forward where engineers could get them across. Artillery continued to strike German positions. The Canadians shifted from a fast, simultaneous assault toward a slower fight for each dike, house, and firing point. This was the part of the battle where the map became more important than the order of battle. A tank didn't arrive on Kapelsche Veer and immediately become decisive. It had to cross a repaired bridge or a floating raft. It had to move along a narrow dike track. It had to avoid soft ground, craters, wrecks, and mud. It had to keep enough ammunition to support the infantry. It had to reverse along the same route when it needed fuel, shells, maintenance, or evacuation. 2 Stuart tanks crossed the Mad Whore's dream. Their 37mm guns and machine guns gave the infantry fire support. Their armour also helped move ammunition and wounded men along exposed dikes. But the Stuarts couldn't turn freely, and they couldn't erase the German defensive system. Shermans were more powerful, but more difficult to bring forward. At the Charlot crossing, the engineers worked through ice and snow to ferry tanks onto the island. A tank damaged the raft ramp while loading, delaying the movement. On 28th of January, 3 tanks finally crossed. One crossing took hours because ice packed around the raft and its propellers. The weather was changing at the same time. Snow and ice gave way to thawing mud. Canadian engineer accounts describe tanks, buffaloes, bulldozers, and recovery vehicles becoming stuck, then pulling one another free. A disabled tank on a narrow dike did more than remove one gun from the battle. It blocked the route behind it. Across several days, fighting around Grapes and Raspberry showed the battlefield problem. The 2 houses were small objectives, but each sat inside a broader web of trenches, dugouts, dike positions, and concealed firing points. Canadian troops could reach one house and still face fire from the surrounding ground. Thawing, wet polder ground, snow, artillery fire, and German counterattacks repeatedly disrupted Canadian progress. Tanks could support the infantry only where the narrow dike routes and ground conditions allowed. Mud, narrow tracks, and direct fire could prevent the armour from concentrating where the Canadians needed it. The dikes turned mobility into a bottleneck. A house could be occupied, a dike could be reached, a tank could fire from a forward position. But unless the surrounding defensive ground was cleared, the defenders could still hit the attackers from covered positions and force them to give back space. Later accounts describe underground tunnels around Grapes and Raspberry. The more firmly documented features were dugouts, trenches, bunkers, dike positions, and fortified houses. Whatever the exact layout beneath the buildings, the Germans had enough covered ground to survive bombardment and launch local counterattacks. The 10th Canadian Infantry Brigade historian described the fighting as sheer misery. 5 days of combat had reduced the grand plan to a succession of small, costly actions. A few men advancing along a dike, a tank firing from a cramped position, engineers struggling with ice and mud, wounded men carried back along routes that could close at any moment. The Canadians still had artillery, tanks, smoke, engineers, and flamethrowers. Yet none of those tools could cancel the conditions on the ground. Smoke didn't always stay where the plan required it. Wasps couldn't always reach the dike tops. Tanks couldn't always move where the infantry needed them. Artillery could damage defensive positions, but infantry still had to occupy the ground after the shelling stopped. That is why a small German garrison could resist for days. It wasn't invulnerability, it was a layered defence built in the right place. The German side was also under increasing pressure. Canadian artillery hit movement across the river. On 30th January, German attempts to bring reinforcements onto the island by ferry failed when Canadian fire sank the ferries. The bridgehead was becoming harder to sustain. Canadian infantry and tanks had gained positions on the island. The defenders had suffered casualties, frostbite, exhaustion, and the loss of resupply routes. The precise German decision to withdraw remains unclear. No complete order, route plan, or timetable survives in the material available for this battle. The pressure of Canadian attacks, artillery interdiction, failed ferries, casualties, and changing circumstances across the wider front all formed part of the situation. What happened next is firmly documented. On the morning of 31st January, German artillery opened a massive barrage. Under that barrage, the remaining German paratroopers evacuated Kapelsche Veer. The artillery fire matters because it corrects the most misleading version of the ending. The Canadian units didn't simply walk into a battlefield where every German had silently disappeared in the night. The defenders withdrew under cover of heavy fire while the Canadians completed their advance. At about 8 o'clock that morning, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders linked up with the Lincoln and Welland Regiment. The German bridgehead had been cleared. The official military language later stated that all enemies south of the Maas had been liquidated. In that context, the phrase meant the bridgehead had been eliminated. It didn't mean that every German defender had been killed. There had been no annihilating last stand at Grapes and Raspberry. There had been no mass surrender. The paratroopers had defended the position through repeated attacks, then withdrawn across the Maas under artillery cover when the bridgehead could no longer be held. Counting the human cost is harder than mapping the battlefield. Canada's official account records more than 183 casualties in the Lincoln and Welland Regiment alone during 6 days of Operation Elephant, including 50 dead. That figure makes the lower Canadian totals, sometimes repeated in later summaries, impossible to accept as a complete accounting of the operation. German losses are also disputed. One official history-derived estimate gives 145 German dead, 64 wounded, and 34 prisoners. Other later accounts offer substantially lower figures for German killed and wounded. The totals depend on whether they count only the final Canadian operation, the entire 5-week battle, prisoners, missing men, frostbite, or casualties during the earlier Polish and Royal Marine attacks. A commonly cited total of 364 Allied killed and wounded across all attacks can't be fully reconciled with every unit figure. Dutch commemorative accounts give approximately 450 to 465 Allied casualties. A Canadian engineer history estimates that nearly 1,200 soldiers were killed or wounded on both sides during the 4 major assaults. The numbers differ. The cost does not. Polish soldiers attacked in late December and early January. Royal Marines and Norwegian troops attacked in mid-January. Canadian infantrymen, tank crews, engineers, artillerymen and carrier crews fought from 26 to 31st January. The Lincoln and Wellands lost men in frozen water and on exposed dikes. The Argylls fought forward through the same mud and shell fire. South Alberta crews brought tanks across bridges and rafts built under enemy observation. Engineers of the 9th Field Squadron spent days keeping routes open through ice, craters, mud and artillery fire. Kapelsche Veer was only a small fortified foothold beside a ferry harbour, but its fields had no cover, its dikes restricted movement, its houses were fortified, its defenders could counterattack from prepared positions. The ground repeatedly broke apart the Canadian Combined Arms Plan before infantry, tanks and engineers could all arrive at the same point together. That is how a garrison of roughly 150 paratroopers held out through repeated Allied attacks. And that is why Operation Elephant ended as it did. Canadian units linked up on 31st January, while the surviving German defenders had already crossed the Maas beneath a massive artillery barrage. The position was empty. The cost wasn't.